Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I was 23 when I first heard about Stillwater Ridge, a mining settlement that supposedly existed somewhere in the backwoods of eastern Tennessee. The information came from my roommate's uncle, a guy named Dale who collected old county records like some people collect baseball cards. He'd found references to Stillwater in deeds from the 1890s, but nothing after 1923. No closure notice, no transfer of ownership, just a hard stop in the paperwork like someone had taken an eraser to history. That November, I was between semesters and had more time than sense. My buddy Marcus was the same way. We'd been exploring abandoned places since high school, old factories, shuttered hospitals, that sort of thing. A genuine ghost town felt like the natural next step. Dale gave us coordinates and a warning that the roads out there weren't maintained, which we figured just meant we'd need to hike the last few miles. What we didn't account for was how quickly the landscape would turn hostile. We left Knoxville early on a Saturday morning, Marcus driving his beat-up Ford Ranger while I navigated with a printed topographic map. Cell service dropped about 40 minutes in, right around the time the highway narrowed to a two-lane country route. The trees closed in tight on both sides, their bare branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the weak winter sunlight. Everything had that gray, washed-out quality that comes right before snow. The coordinates led us to a fire road that hadn't seen traffic in years. Saplings pushed up through cracks in the pavement, and the whole thing tilted at an angle that made the truck's suspension groan. We parked where the road simply ended, swallowed by undergrowth, and packed light, water, flashlights, cameras, a first aid kit. The air outside had a sharp bite to it, cold enough to sting your lungs, but not quite freezing. Dead leaves crunched under our boots as we started hiking deeper into the woods. After about an hour of walking through increasingly dense forest, we crested a ridge and saw it. Stillwater Ridge spread out below us in a shallow valley, maybe 15 buildings in total, arranged along what had once been a main street. Most structures were in surprisingly good condition. Roofs intact, walls standing straight, windows mostly unbroken. It didn't have that picked-over, vandalized look you usually see. It looked preserved, like someone had been maintaining it, which made no sense given how remote we were. The first building we checked was what appeared to be a general store, identifiable by the faded lettering above the door that read, "Provisions and Sundries." The door hung slightly open, revealing shelves still lined with rusted cans and glass bottles thick with dust. Marcus immediately started photographing everything, that excited look on his face like a kid in a candy store. I was more focused on how quiet everything was. No birds, no wind through the trees, not even the usual creaks and settling sounds you expect from old buildings. Just this heavy, waiting silence. We moved systematically through the town, checking each structure. There was a small church with pews still arranged in neat rows, a schoolhouse with a chalkboard that still had lessons written on it in faded white chalk, and a row of houses that varied from 1 to 2 rooms. In one house, we found a dinner table set for 4, plates and silverware arranged as if waiting for a meal that never came. A layer of dust covered everything, but beneath it, you could see the careful placement, the domesticity frozen in time. Marcus was thrilled. He kept talking about how pristine everything was, how we'd stumbled onto something special. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. It took me a while to put my finger on it, but eventually I realized what bothered me. There were no signs of departure. No drawers left open, no belongings scattered in haste, no indication that people had packed up and moved. It looked more like everyone had simply vanished mid-activity, leaving everything exactly as it was. Around mid-afternoon, we found the mine entrance at the far end of town. It was a horizontal shaft driven into the hillside, reinforced with timber supports that had somehow remained solid despite their age. A rusted rail cart sat on tracks leading into the darkness. Marcus wanted to explore inside, but I drew the line there. Mine shafts were legitimately dangerous, prone to collapse and filled with bad air. We compromised by photographing the entrance thoroughly before moving on. That's when we found the other town. We'd been walking back toward our original entry point when Marcus spotted what he thought was a different building through the trees. We pushed through some undergrowth to get a better look. And suddenly, we were standing at the edge of Stillwater Ridge again. Same layout, same buildings, same main street. At first, I thought we'd gotten turned around, circled back without realizing it. But when we walked down the main street, everything was different in subtle ways. The general store's sign now read Sundries and Provisions instead of Provisions and Sundries. The church was on the opposite side of the street. The schoolhouse had a different number of windows. The house with the dinner table was gone entirely, replaced by what looked like a blacksmith's shop. It was like looking at Stillwater Ridge through a warped mirror, recognizable but fundamentally altered. Marcus tried to rationalize it. Maybe Dale's records had been wrong. Maybe there were two settlements here, built by different mining companies. But I'd seen the topographic map. There was only supposed to be one town in this valley. And anyway, the differences were too specific, too deliberately inverted. This wasn't a coincidence or a separate settlement. This was something else entirely. We decided to head back to the first town, regroup, and figure out what was happening. But when we retraced our steps, we couldn't find it. We walked in what should have been the right direction for 20 minutes, but all we found was more forest. No buildings, no cleared valley, nothing. Marcus pulled out his compass, but the needle spun lazily without settling on any particular direction. My watch had stopped at 2:47, though I could have sworn it had been working fine earlier. Panic started creeping in then. That tight feeling in your chest when you realize you're not in control of the situation. We tried marking our path, breaking branches and piling rocks, but every time we thought we were making progress, we'd emerge back into the second version of Stillwater Ridge. It was like the town had gravity, pulling us back no matter which direction we walked. By the time the lights started fading, we'd given up trying to leave and focused on finding shelter. The temperature was dropping fast, and neither of us wanted to spend the night exposed. We chose one of the larger houses, a 2-story structure that seemed stable and had an intact fireplace. Marcus found wood stacked neatly beside the hearth, which should have been encouraging, but somehow made things worse. Who had stacked that wood? When? We got a fire going as darkness fell. The flames provided light and warmth, but did nothing to ease the oppressive silence. Marcus kept checking his phone as if service would miraculously return. I stared out the window at the empty street, watching shadows stretch and deepen between the buildings. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing in the doorway of the church across the street, perfectly still, just a silhouette against the deeper darkness inside. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow, proportions slightly off, posture too rigid. I grabbed Marcus's arm and pointed, but by the time he looked, it was gone. He thought I was seeing things, letting fear get to me. Maybe I was. But then we both heard the footsteps. They came from upstairs, slow and deliberate, crossing from one side of the house to the other. The floorboards creaked under weight that shouldn't exist. We sat frozen, not speaking, not moving, just listening to something walk back and forth above our heads. It went on for maybe 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound. Marcus wanted to investigate. I absolutely did not. We compromised by calling out, asking if anyone was there. No response, just that thick, suffocating quiet. Eventually, Marcus grabbed his flashlight and started toward the stairs. I followed because the alternative was staying alone in that room, and that felt even more terrifying. The second floor consisted of 3 small bedrooms arranged off a central hallway. All the doors stood open except one at the far end, which was closed. Marcus approached it slowly, flashlight beam wobbling slightly because his hand was shaking. He reached for the doorknob, turned it, pushed the door open. The room was empty, completely bare except for a mirror mounted on the far wall, old and silvered with age. But in the mirror's reflection, the room wasn't empty. We could see furniture. A bed, a dresser, a rocking chair with someone sitting in it. An old woman with long grey hair, wearing a faded dress, staring directly at us with eyes that were too dark, too hollow. Marcus swung his flashlight toward where the rocking chair should be. Nothing there, just empty floor. We backed out of that room fast, not bothering to close the door, and practically ran down the stairs. The fire had gone out while we were upstairs, reduced to cold ash despite burning hot just minutes before. And in the ash, someone had written a message with their finger, "You're in the wrong one." That broke us. We grabbed our packs and fled into the night. No plan, no direction, just pure animal panic. We ran through the dark streets of that impossible town, past buildings that seemed to shift and rearrange when we weren't looking directly at them. Twice I could have sworn we passed the same church, but it was in different locations each time. The geometry refused to make sense. Eventually, we crashed through undergrowth, and suddenly we were climbing uphill, the trees thinning around us. We kept going until we hit the ridge we'd originally descended, and there below us was the truck, right where we'd left it. We didn't question it, didn't stop to think, just scrambled down and threw ourselves inside. Marcus turned the key with shaking hands, and by some miracle, the engine turned over. We drove without stopping until we hit the highway, and even then, we didn't slow down until we could see lights from a town. Real lights, from a real town, with real people and functioning cell service. We ended up at a truck stop outside Crossville, sitting in the harsh fluorescent light of a Waffle House at 3 a.m, drinking coffee and not talking about what we'd seen. The next day, we compared our photos. Marcus had taken dozens, documenting every building, every detail. But when we looked through them, half showed the first version of Stillwater Ridge and half showed the second. They were mixed randomly throughout the timeline. Sometimes 3 photos of the first version, then 1 of the second, then 2 more of the first. We'd been moving between them without realizing it, and the camera had captured both. I haven't been back to those woods, and I never will. Marcus became obsessed with it for a while, spent months researching mirror towns and parallel places, trying to find some framework to explain what we'd experienced. He never found one that satisfied him. Eventually, he stopped talking about it, but I know he still thinks about it. We both do. Sometimes I wonder about the old woman in the mirror, about the message in the ash. You're in the wrong one. Wrong one what? Wrong town, wrong reality. And if we were in the wrong one, where was the right one? Was there a version of us still wandering through that valley, unable to find their way out, trapped between 2 versions of a town that shouldn't exist? I don't have answers. All I know is that there are places in this world where the rules break down, where reality gets thin and strange things leak through. Stillwater Ridge is one of them, and whatever exists there in that valley, preserving those buildings and maintaining that perfect, terrible stillness. I don't think it's finished. I think it's still waiting, patient and hungry, for the next people who come looking for a ghost town and find something much worse instead. The winter I turned 25, I took a contract job doing wildlife surveys in the mountains of western Montana. The pay was decent, the work was solitary, and I needed time away from people after a rough breakup that left me questioning pretty much every decision I'd made in my 20s. The job involved hiking predetermined routes, documenting animal tracks and signs, and collecting data on population movements. Simple, methodical, and blessedly free of human drama. My supervisor, a grizzled Forest Service veteran named Carl, gave me a list of survey routes that crisscrossed public land in the remote corners of Mineral County. Most were straightforward, established trails with clear waypoints. But one route caught my attention because of the note Carl had scribbled in the margin. Skip Greystone if weather's bad. Old mining camp, not worth the trouble. Naturally, that made me want to check it out. I asked Carl about it over coffee one morning at the ranger station. He got quiet for a moment, then told me that Greystone had been abandoned in the 1930s after a particularly brutal winter. Something about the mine closing, the workers leaving, the usual story. But he'd heard from older rangers that people who visited the site sometimes came back confused, disoriented, reporting time losses and memory gaps. He thought it was probably just the altitude and the isolation playing tricks, but he'd made it policy to avoid sending people there alone. Of course, that just made me more determined to see it. I was young enough to think I was immune to the things that bothered other people, arrogant enough to assume I'd handle it better. So, in mid-January, I loaded my truck with cold weather gear and headed out to find Greystone. The drive took most of the morning, following a series of increasingly rough forest roads until I reached a parking area that looked like it hadn't been used in years. From there, the route to Greystone was a 6-mile hike through heavy snow. I strapped on snowshoes and started walking, following a creek drainage up into higher elevations. The forest was thick with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, everything silent under a blanket of fresh powder. Around midday, I crested a ridge and saw the town below. Greystone sat in a bowl-shaped valley, maybe 20 structures spread out along a central thoroughfare. Unlike most ghost towns I'd seen, this one looked almost pristine. The buildings stood straight and solid, roofs intact, no visible damage from weather or time. Snow had drifted against the walls, but not in the chaotic patterns you'd expect. It looked deliberate, sculpted, like someone had been maintaining the place. The first thing I noticed when I entered the valley was the temperature. It dropped noticeably, maybe 10 or 15 degrees colder than it should have been at that elevation. My breath came out in thick white clouds, and frost immediately formed on my beard. The air felt heavier too, like trying to breathe through damp cloth. I pulled my neck gaiter up and kept walking, telling myself it was just a quirk of the terrain, cold air settling in the valley. The main street was perfectly clear of snow, which made no sense. Drifts piled high on either side, but the street itself was bare, revealing ancient wooden boards underneath. I could see my footprints clearly in the frost that covered everything, the only tracks visible. No animal prints, no signs of recent human activity, nothing but undisturbed whiteness. I started documenting the site, taking photographs and notes about the structures. The first building appeared to be a bunkhouse, long and narrow with rows of small windows. I pushed the door open and found the interior frozen solid, literally frozen, with ice coating every surface, like someone had hosed the place down and let it crystallize. Bunks lined the walls, and on several of them I could see shapes under blankets, bodies curled up as if sleeping. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong, but curiosity and professional obligation kept me moving forward. I approached one of the bunks, pulled back the blanket, and found a man lying there. He was perfectly preserved, frozen solid, skin pale and lips blue. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, and there was no expression on his face, no fear, no pain, just blank emptiness. He wore work clothes from another era, heavy canvas pants and a wool shirt. I checked another bunk, another frozen man, and another. The entire bunkhouse was filled with them, maybe 30 men in total, all frozen in various positions of rest. Some curled on their sides, some flat on their backs, one sitting upright against the wall, all with that same blank expression, all perfectly preserved, all impossible. My hands were shaking as I photographed everything, my breath coming faster, creating clouds of vapor that hung in the still air. The rational part of my mind tried to construct explanations. Maybe it was some kind of display, mannequins set up by historians or artists. But I could see individual hairs on their arms, the texture of their skin, tiny details that no mannequin could replicate. I backed out of the bunkhouse and moved to the next building, a structure that looked like it had been a general store. Inside, more frozen people. A woman behind the counter, hand reaching towards something I couldn't see. A man by the shelves, head turned as if listening. A child sitting on the floor with a wooden toy. All frozen, all preserved, all wrong. Every building was the same. The town wasn't abandoned. It was inhabited by frozen people, caught in mid-action, preserved in whatever moment had claimed them. In the church I found an entire congregation, men, women, children, sitting in pews, facing an empty pulpit. In one house, a family sat around a dinner table, forks halfway to mouths, food still on plates. Everything was frozen, crystallized, locked in a moment that had never ended. The horror of it was overwhelming. This wasn't death as I understood it. Death involved decay, dissolution, the natural processes of the body breaking down. This was suspension, preservation, people trapped in an eternal instant. The expressions on their faces suggested they were aware of it. Consciousness locked in frozen flesh, unable to move or scream or escape. I was backing away from a house when I heard it, a cracking sound, sharp and clear in the silent air. I spun around and saw movement in one of the windows I'd just passed. Behind the glass, one of the frozen people was moving, or trying to. Their head turned slowly, incrementally, ice crackling and shedding from their face. Their eyes found me, and I saw awareness there, recognition, and something that might have been pleading. I ran, pure instinct, no thought, just raw terror propelling me back toward the main street. Behind me, I heard more cracking sounds, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. Windows shattered, doors groaned. The frozen people were waking up, thawing, moving. I didn't look back, just focused on getting to the edge of town, on reaching the tree line and the path that would take me away from this place. Something grabbed my ankle. I went down hard, face first into the snow. When I rolled over, I saw a man crawling after me, fingers digging into the ground, pulling himself forward with agonizing slowness. His face was still partially frozen, one side mobile while the other remained locked in ice. He opened his mouth and made a sound, not words, just a raw, anguished moan that seemed to contain decades of trapped silence. I kicked free and scrambled to my feet, running again. More figures were emerging from buildings, moving with that same terrible slowness, limbs cracking and popping as ice broke away. They weren't chasing me exactly, just moving, finally able to move after being trapped for so long. Some fell and couldn't get back up. Others stumbled against walls or into snow drifts. They were like newborns trying to navigate bodies they'd forgotten how to control. I made it to the tree line and kept running, snowshoes flapping and tangling, several times falling and getting back up. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the drainage, lungs burning, legs trembling from exertion and fear. Only then did I risk a look back. The valley was quiet again, no movement visible, but I could feel something watching, waiting, patient in a way that transcended human understanding. The hike back to my truck took half the time it should have because I barely stopped, driven by adrenaline and terror. I threw my gear in the back and drove straight through to the ranger station, arriving around midnight. Carl was still there, working late on paperwork. He took one look at my face and knew something had happened. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression getting more grim as the story went on. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me that I wasn't the first person to report finding frozen people in grey stone. Every few years, Someone would hike up there and come back with the same story. A town full of perfectly preserved bodies, seemingly alive but trapped in ice. He'd gone up there himself once, back in the 70s, to investigate the reports. Found exactly what I'd described, buildings full of frozen people, all preserved, all impossible. He'd photographed everything, documented it thoroughly, and reported it to his supervisors. They'd sent a team out to investigate further, but when they reached the valley, they found nothing. Just empty buildings, no bodies, no ice, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. The photographs Carl had taken showed only empty rooms. After that, the Forest Service had quietly decided to discourage people from visiting Greystone. They couldn't explain what was happening there. Couldn't reconcile the reports with the physical evidence that seemed to contradict them, so they designated it as hazardous terrain, removed it from official maps, and hoped people would simply forget about it. But people didn't forget. Every few years, someone would find their way to that valley, and some of them would see the frozen people. Others would find nothing. There was no pattern to it, no way to predict who would experience what. It was as if the valley existed in multiple states simultaneously, and which version you encountered was purely random. I asked Carl what he thought was happening there. He considered the question for a while before answering. He said he thought Greystone existed at a kind of intersection, a place where different times or realities overlapped. The people in that town had gotten caught in whatever event created the intersection, trapped in a moment that kept repeating. Most of the time, they were frozen, locked in stasis. But occasionally, maybe when conditions were right or when someone visited the valley, they could move again, briefly experiencing animation before sliding back into their frozen state. It wasn't a scientific explanation, but it was the only framework that made sense of what we'd both witnessed. I asked if there was anything we could do to help them, to free them somehow. Carl shook his head. People had tried over the years, building fires in the buildings, bringing in equipment to raise the temperature, even attempting to physically remove some of the frozen people. Nothing worked. The valley maintained its own rules, and those rules didn't bend to human intervention. I quit the wildlife survey job that week. Couldn't handle being out in those mountains anymore, knowing what was lurking in one of those valleys. I moved to Portland, got a desk job doing data analysis. About as far from that kind of field work as I could get. But I still think about them. The frozen people of Greystone, trapped in their eternal moment. The man who grabbed my ankle, finally able to move after decades of paralysis, only to watch me escape while he remained behind. The child with the wooden toy, the family at their dinner table, the congregation in their church, all of them still there, still frozen, still waiting. Sometimes I wonder if they're aware during the frozen periods, consciousness trapped in immobile flesh, experiencing every second of every day in full awareness. Or if they slip into something like sleep, only waking when visitors arrive and the valley shifts into its active state. I don't know which would be worse. What I do know is that there are places in this world where the normal rules don't apply, where time and space get tangled up in ways we don't understand. Greystone is one of them, and whatever happened there in the 1930s, whatever catastrophe or cosmic accident created that intersection, it's still happening, still trapping those people in a loop they can't escape. The worst part is knowing there's nothing anyone can do about it. No rescue, no resolution, no way to end their suffering. They're beyond our reach, beyond our help, frozen in a moment that will never end. And the valley just sits there in those Montana mountains, waiting quietly for the next person who'll stumble across it and witness the horror for themselves, before forgetting again, the evidence erasing itself, the cycle continuing. I was 28 when I took my cousin Riley on what was supposed to be a simple weekend trip exploring abandoned mining towns in Colorado's San Juan Mountains. Riley was 19, taking a gap year before college, and had been pestering me for months to take him somewhere interesting. I'd been documenting ghost towns for a blog I ran. Nothing serious, just a hobby that got me outdoors and away from my IT job in Denver. Seemed like a good way to spend a September weekend. We left Friday morning in my Jeep, heading southwest toward the mountains. The plan was to hit 3 towns over 2 days: Animas Forks, Carson, and a lesser-known site called Shepherd's Point that I'd found mentioned in some old mining records. The first 2 were well-documented, practically tourist attractions. Shepherd's Point was different. I could only find 2 references to it, one in a 1892 newspaper article about a mining claim dispute, and another in a county land survey from 1904. After that, nothing. No closure records, no transfer of property, just silence. The drive was spectacular, autumn colors painting the high country in brilliant golds and reds. We hit Animas Forks first, spent a few hours photographing the old buildings and mill, then pushed on toward Carson. By the time we finished there, the sun was getting low, and I suggested we camp nearby and tackle Shepherd's Point fresh in the morning. Riley was eager to keep going, though, and the dirt road leading toward the site looked manageable, so I relented. Big mistake. The road deteriorated fast, becoming more of a goat path than anything a vehicle should attempt. We pushed on for about 40 minutes, the Jeep lurching and groaning over rocks and through muddy ruts. Just when I was about to turn back, we crested a ridge and saw the town below us. Shepherd's Point sat in a narrow valley, squeezed between steep mountainsides that blocked the dying sunlight. Maybe 15 buildings total, arranged along a main street that ran perpendicular to our approach. What struck me immediately was how intact everything looked. No collapsed roofs, no obvious structural damage, just buildings that looked like they'd been built last year instead of over a century ago. We parked at the edge of town and started walking. The first thing Riley noticed was the street signs. They were modern, green metal with white lettering, but the names were strange. One read, Beginning End Road. Another said, First Last Street. The main thoroughfare had a sign that read, Forward Back Avenue. It didn't make sense. Ghost towns don't have modern street signs, and even if someone had installed them as art or a joke, why use such bizarre names? The buildings were equally strange. They looked old, weathered wood, vintage construction techniques, but they were in perfect condition. Fresh paint on some, unbroken windows on others, roofs that showed no signs of age or weather damage. It was like someone had built a brand new town using century-old methods and then let it sit completely undisturbed. We approached the first building, what appeared to be a saloon, based on the faded lettering above the door. I pushed the door open, and Riley followed me inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading daylight through the windows. Tables and chairs were arranged as if waiting for customers. Bottles lined the bar, full and sealed. A staircase at the back led to a second floor. That's when we noticed the clock on the wall. It was running, ticking audibly in the quiet room. But the hands were moving backwards, counterclockwise, each tick taking them further back in time. Riley pointed at it, confused, and I walked over to examine it more closely. The mechanism looked completely normal except for the reversed movement. I checked my phone to see what time it showed. 6:47 p.m. The backwards clock showed 5:13, and as I watched, it ticked backward to 5:12. We left the saloon and checked the next building, a general store. Inside, we found shelves stocked with goods, but something was wrong with all of it. The labels on cans were printed in reverse, mirror writing that you could only read properly if you held them up to a reflective surface. The floorboards ran in alternating directions, forward then backward, creating a dizzying pattern. And in the back room, we found a calendar hanging on the wall. It was for October 1893, but the days were numbered in reverse, 31 at the beginning of the month, 1 at the end. Riley was getting uncomfortable, kept saying we should leave. I agreed, but I wanted to check one more building first, a house at the end of the street that looked particularly well preserved. We approached it as the last light faded from the valley, leaving everything in deep shadow. The front door was unlocked. Inside, we found a living room furnished with period-appropriate furniture: horsehair sofa, oil lamps, a cast-iron stove. But everything was arranged backwards. The sofa faced away from the fireplace. Pictures hung on the walls upside down. Books on a shelf were organized with spines facing inward, titles hidden. We were examining the books when we heard footsteps upstairs. Not loud, just quiet creaking as someone walked across the floor above our heads. Riley grabbed my arm, eyes wide. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response, just continued footsteps, walking from one end of the house to the other. I'm not particularly brave, but I've dealt with enough abandoned buildings to know that squatters and homeless people sometimes took shelter in them. Better to announce our presence than startle someone. I headed for the stairs with Riley reluctantly following. The steps creaked under our weight, each one protesting our ascent. The second floor consisted of 3 rooms off a central hallway. The footsteps had stopped. I checked the first room. Empty bedroom, bed neatly made. Second room, same thing. The third door at the end of the hall was closed. I approached it carefully, turned the knob, pushed it open. The room contained a single chair facing the window. Someone sat in it, completely still, silhouetted against the darkening sky outside. I couldn't make out details, just a human-shaped figure, motionless. I said hello again. No response. I took a step closer, and the figure spoke without turning around. "You're going the wrong way." The voice was strange, hollow, like it was coming from far away despite the person being right in front of me. I asked what they meant. Riley tugged on my sleeve, trying to pull me back toward the hallway, but I was frozen, transfixed by this mysterious figure. "Everyone who comes here goes the wrong way," the voice continued. "They walk forward into a backwards place. Creates a conflict, pulls you in deeper. You should be walking backwards. That's the only way to leave." I asked who they were. The figure finally moved, head turning slowly toward us. In the dim light, I couldn't see their face clearly, just a pale oval where features should be, no definition, like looking at someone through frosted glass. "I was the first," they said. "Found this place in 1893, tried to build a life here, didn't understand the nature of it. By the time I figured it out, it was too late. I'd become part of it, reversed along with everything else." Riley was pulling harder now, genuinely frightened. I let him pull me backward into the hallway. The figure in the chair didn't move again, just remained facing us with that featureless face. We backed down the stairs, neither of us willing to turn around, some instinct telling us that showing our backs to this thing would be dangerous. We got outside, and Riley started running toward the Jeep. I followed, but something was wrong. The distance felt wrong. We should have reached the vehicle quickly. It wasn't more than 100 yards from where we'd been, but the more we ran, the further away it seemed to get, receding into the darkness like a mirage. I remembered what the figure had said about walking backwards. It sounded insane, but everything about this place was insane. I grabbed Riley and told him to stop running. He argued, panicked, but I insisted. I explained what the figure had said, and suggested we try moving backwards instead of forwards. Riley thought I'd lost my mind, but he was scared enough to try anything. We turned around, facing back toward the town, and started walking backwards. Immediately, I felt the change. The resistance we'd been moving against disappeared. The Jeep, which had been impossibly distant, suddenly felt closer. We kept moving backwards, step by careful step, watching the dark buildings recede. It was terrifying, not being able to see where we were going, having to trust our backward steps, keeping our eyes on a ghost town that had revealed itself to be something far stranger and more dangerous than we'd imagined. It took maybe 5 minutes of backward walking before we felt the jeep behind us. I reached back, touched the hood, the contact reassuringly solid. We kept going backwards until we'd reached the driver's side door. I fumbled for the handle without looking, got it open, and we both scrambled inside. I didn't turn around to start the engine. Some deep instinct told me that wouldn't work. Instead, I put the key in the ignition while facing backwards, shifted into reverse, and started backing up. The Jeep responded normally, engine running smoothly, wheels gripping the rough road. We drove backwards out of that valley, navigating by the mirrors, neither of us speaking. It was insanely difficult. The road was barely a path, filled with rocks and ruts, and I was trying to follow it in reverse in near total darkness. But somehow, it worked. The Jeep handled it, finding traction where it shouldn't have, avoiding obstacles I couldn't see. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the valley opened up and we reached the ridge where we'd first spotted Shepherd's Point. Only then did I risk turning the Jeep around. The engine stuttered when I shifted into drive, almost stalled, but caught and held. I hit the gas and we roared away from that place, bouncing violently over the rough road, not caring about the damage to the suspension, just focused on getting distance between us and that backwards town. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached a gas station outside of Durango. Riley was shaking, sitting in the passenger seat with his arms wrapped around himself. I wasn't much better. We sat in the harsh fluorescent light of the parking lot, drinking bad coffee and trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I called a friend who was into folklore and weird phenomena, told him about Shepherd's Point. He listened without interrupting, then went quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, he asked if I'd heard of temporal inversions, places where the normal flow of time breaks down or reverses. I hadn't. He explained that there were theories about such places existing at certain geographic points, locations where the usual rules of causality didn't apply properly. According to him, if Shepherd's Point was such a place, then everything there would exist in a reversed state. Time flowing backwards, cause following effect instead of preceding it, even physical laws operating in inverted fashion. Anyone entering such a place would create a paradox, a forward-moving being in a backward-moving environment. The only way to resolve the paradox would be to match the inversion, to move backwards yourself. The figure in the house, he suggested, had probably been someone who'd stayed too long, who'd gotten trapped by the inversion and eventually synchronized with it. They'd become part of the backwards place, unable to leave because their personal timeline had reversed to match their surroundings. The warning they'd given us might have been the last act of their forward-moving consciousness before it fully inverted. I asked if there was any way to help them, to reverse the process. My friend didn't think so. Once you'd fully synchronized with a temporal inversion, you were locked into it. Your past became your future became your past. You'd age backwards, experience memories in reverse order, eventually return to a state of unbirth. It was, he said, a truly horrible fate. Riley never quite recovered from the experience. He ended up not taking that gap year after all, went straight to college, threw himself into his studies as a way of coping. We don't talk about that night. By unspoken agreement, we've both decided it's better to pretend it didn't happen. But I still think about Shepherd's Point, about that figure in the chair, trapped in their backwards existence, watching forward-moving time from the wrong side. About the town itself, preserved perfectly because it's moving against the flow of entropy, aging in reverse. And I wonder how many other places like that exist, hidden in remote valleys and forgotten corners, waiting for unsuspecting explorers to stumble into their inverted realities. I've never tried to find Shepherd's Point again. Deleted all the photos I took, removed any reference to it from my blog. Some places shouldn't be documented, shouldn't be remembered. They're better left forgotten, existing in their strange isolated states without human interference. Because the alternative, spreading knowledge about them, encouraging others to seek them out, feels deeply irresponsible. Nobody else needs to experience what we did, to risk getting trapped in a backwoods existence. The only evidence I kept is this story, and even now I'm not sure I should be sharing it. If you're reading this and thinking about looking for Shepherd's Point, don't. Please. It's not worth the risk. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some places better left unexplored. The backwoods town is one of them. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. My girlfriend Sarah and I were driving through northern Idaho that October, taking the scenic route from Spokane to Boise for a wedding. We'd left early, planning to make the drive in one day, but around mid-afternoon we hit unexpected road construction that added 2 hours to our trip. By the time we got past the delays, the sun was setting and we were both exhausted from the stop-and-go traffic. Sarah suggested we find a motel and finish the drive in the morning. I pulled up Google Maps to see what was available, but we were in a pretty remote stretch, nothing showing up for the next 40 miles except one tiny dot labeled Thornwood. No chain motels, no familiar names. Just that single settlement sitting off the highway about 15 minutes down a side road. We decided to check it out. Worst case, we'd turn around and push through to the next town. The turnoff came up quickly, marked by a faded green sign that simply read, Thornwood, 7 miles. The road was paved but rough, patched in places but mostly just worn down by time and weather. The landscape changed as we drove, trees crowding closer to the road, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the remaining daylight. Everything got darker, quieter, like we were driving into a tunnel. Sarah commented on how isolated it felt, how you'd never know there was a town out here if you weren't specifically looking for it. Thornwood appeared suddenly around a bend. It was small, one main street with buildings clustered on both sides, maybe 30 structures total. Most looked abandoned or close to it, windows dark, paint peeling, porches sagging. But at the far end of the street, we saw lights, a 2-story building with an illuminated sign that read Thornwood Inn in cursive neon. The parking lot held 2 other vehicles, a pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in years and a sedan with local plates. We pulled in next to the sedan and headed inside. The lobby was small but clean, decorated in a style that was probably modern in 1975. Wood paneling, orange carpet, a desk with a little bell for service. An old man emerged from a back room when I rang the bell. He was probably in his 70s, thin and weathered, with eyes that seemed too large for his face. He greeted us warmly enough, asked how long we'd be staying. I told him just one night, and he nodded, reaching for a key hanging on the wall behind him. "Room 6, he said, sliding an actual metal key across the desk. "2nd floor, end of the hall. Quiet room, good view." I paid cash. Their credit card machine was down, which didn't surprise me given the general condition of everything. He gave me a receipt written by hand on a carbon copy form. As we headed for the stairs, he called after us, "Don't leave your curtains open after dark." I turned back confused. He was already disappearing into his back room, not waiting for questions. Sarah and I exchanged a look. Weird advice, but old-timers in small towns often had odd habits and superstitions. We filed it away as local color and headed upstairs. Room 6 was at the end of a hallway that smelled like mothballs and old wood. The door stuck slightly when I turned the key, swollen from humidity, but eventually gave way. Inside, we found a basic motel room. Double bed, small TV, bathroom with rust stains in the sink. But it was clean, the bed looked comfortable, and after hours of driving it was exactly what we needed. The window dominated one wall, large and facing east toward the darkening forest. Heavy curtains hung on either side, open to reveal the view. Sarah walked over to look out while I dropped our bags on the bed. She stood there for a moment, then said something that made my skin prickle. "There's someone out there." I joined her at the window. It took me a moment to see what she was seeing, but then I spotted it. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 200 yards away. Too far to make out details, just a human-shaped silhouette, perfectly still. I suggested it might be someone from town, a local out for an evening walk. Sarah didn't look convinced. They're just standing there, not moving at all. I watched for another minute. She was right. The figure didn't move, didn't shift position, just stood there facing our direction. It was unsettling, but not overtly threatening. Probably just someone smoking a cigarette or enjoying the view. I pulled the curtains closed, remembering the old man's advice. We decided to find dinner before settling in for the night. The motel didn't have a restaurant, but the old man had mentioned a diner 2 blocks down that stayed open late. We walked there, enjoying the cool evening air, the quiet of the small town. Most buildings were dark, clearly abandoned. The few that showed signs of occupation, lights in windows, maintained yards, seemed to huddle together near the center of town as if seeking safety in numbers. The diner was exactly what you'd expect. Vinyl booths, a long counter, a laminated menu featuring standard American fare. We were the only customers. A tired-looking waitress in her 40s took our order. Burgers and fries for both of us, coffee for me, iced tea for Sarah. The food was decent, nothing special, but we were hungry enough not to care. As we ate, I noticed the waitress kept glancing out the window toward the street. Her movements were subtle, but there was a nervous quality to them, like she was checking for something specific. After the 3rd or 4th time, I followed her gaze but saw nothing except the empty street and dark buildings. When she brought our check, I asked if everything was okay. She smiled tightly and said everything was fine, but I could tell she was lying. Before we left, I tried again. The guy at the motel told us to keep our curtains closed after dark. Is there something we should know about? Her expression shifted, becoming more serious. You're staying at the inn? When I nodded, she glanced at the window again, then leaned closer. Did he give you room 6? Another nod. She bit her lip. That's the only room with the window facing east. Everyone else faces west or looks at the parking lot. I asked what was significant about facing east. She shook her head. Just keep the curtains closed. Don't look out after dark. And if you hear tapping on the glass... She trailed off, seemed to reconsider saying more. Just don't open the curtains. We left the diner more unsettled than we'd entered it. Sarah wanted to get back on the road, drive through the night to Boise. I argued we were both too tired, that whatever small-town weirdness was going on, we'd be safe enough in a locked room for one night. She eventually agreed, but I could tell she wasn't happy about it. Back at the inn, we found the lobby empty. The old man's back room showed light under the door, but he didn't emerge when we passed through. We climbed the stairs to room 6, the hallway somehow darker than before despite the same dim bulbs providing illumination. Inside our room, I immediately checked the curtains. Still closed, exactly as I'd left them. I felt foolish for checking. What, did I think someone had snuck in and opened them? But given the strange warnings, it seemed prudent. Sarah was already getting ready for bed, clearly wanting this day to end. I brushed my teeth, changed into sleep clothes, and climbed into bed beside her. The TV picked up about 3 channels with terrible reception, so we just turned it off. By 10 o'clock, we were lying in darkness, exhausted but not quite able to sleep. The room was very quiet. No sounds from other rooms, no traffic noise, just complete silence broken only by our breathing. Around 11, the tapping started. It was soft at first, almost inaudible. Tap, tap, tap. 3 distinct sounds against glass. I sat up, listening. Sarah was already awake, her hand finding mine in the darkness. The tapping came again, Slightly louder. Tap, tap, tap. Deliberate, evenly spaced, patient. It was coming from the window. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the curtains. They were still closed, heavy fabric showing no signs of movement. But the tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft scraping sound like fingernails dragging across a glass. Sarah whispered, "Don't open them." I had no intention of opening them. Whatever was out there could keep tapping all night. I wasn't about to indulge my curiosity by pulling back those curtains. We lay there listening to the sounds, trying to ignore them, telling ourselves it was probably just branches in the wind. Except there was no wind. The tapping grew more insistent around midnight. Not louder, but more frequent, the rhythm faster. Tap, 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 scrape, tap, tap, tap. It sounded agitated, like whatever was making the noise was becoming frustrated. Sarah buried her face in my shoulder, trying to block out the sound. Then a voice came through the glass. Muffled, but distinct. "I can see you in there." My blood went cold. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened painfully. Neither of us moved, barely breathing. How could something see us through closed curtains? Unless... I slowly turned my head and my stomach dropped. There was a gap between the curtains where they met in the middle, maybe an inch wide, just enough to see through from outside. The flashlight on my phone had died, leaving us in darkness, but if there was any light source outside, someone or something could see into our room through that narrow opening. The voice came again. "I've been watching all evening, waiting for dark, waiting for you to look." I wanted to get up, to shove something against the curtains to close the gap, but I was paralyzed with fear. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this had to be a prank, someone from town messing with tourists. But the primitive part, the lizard brain that understood danger on an instinctive level, was convinced we were dealing with something fundamentally wrong. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. We waited, not moving, not speaking, just listening to our own racing hearts. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. Then light flooded the room, bright enough to see through the curtains. Not electric light, something paler, colder, with a slight greenish tint. It illuminated the gap between the curtains, and I could see a shadow there, the silhouette of a head blocking the light, someone pressing their face against the glass. "Why won't you look at me?" The voice was plaintive now, almost hurt. "Everyone else looks eventually. They can't help themselves." "But you're being stubborn." Sarah started crying silently, tears running down her face. I pulled her close, both of us staring at the ceiling, refusing to look toward the window. The shadow moved, the head tilting one way, then the other, as if trying to find a better angle to view us. "I just want you to see me," the voice continued. "Is that so much to ask? I've been alone for so long. Everyone in this town has seen me already. They know better than to look now. But visitors always look. Please, just a glance." There was something horribly lonely in that voice, a desperate hunger that was worse than any threat. This thing, whatever it was, needed to be seen, craved being observed with an intensity that felt almost painful. And I understood instinctively that if we looked, if we acknowledged its presence by viewing it directly, we'd be giving it something we couldn't take back. The light outside intensified, becoming almost painfully bright. The shadow in the gap grew more defined, and I could see features now. The outline of a nose, the curve of a jaw, the hollow where an eye should be. It was pressing harder against the glass, the window creaking under the pressure. "Look at me." The voice was no longer pleading. It was demanding, angry, reverberating with a bass tone that shouldn't have been possible from a single human throat. The window cracked. A sharp sound like a gunshot, then another crack. The glass was breaking. I finally moved, grabbing Sarah and pulling her off the bed. We stumbled across the room toward the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. The window shattered completely behind us, glass exploding inward, curtains whipping in a sudden wind. I didn't look back, just yanked the door open and pulled Sarah into the hallway. The old man was standing there, holding an oil lamp, completely unsurprised by our panicked exit. "Come with me," he said calmly, turning toward the stairs. We followed him down to the lobby, through his office, and into a small apartment at the back of the inn. He gestured for us to sit on a worn couch while he locked the door behind us. The room had no windows, just solid walls lined with books and photographs. "You didn't look," he said, setting the lamp on a table. "Good. Most people can't resist. They hear the voice, see the light, and their curiosity overwhelms their fear. They open the curtains or peek through the gap, and—" He trailed off, shaking his head. I found my voice. "What is it?" He settled into an armchair across from us. "We don't know exactly. It's been here as long as anyone can remember. My grandfather ran this inn before me, and his father before that. It's always been the same. Something in the woods that comes to the window after dark. Always room 6, always the east-facing window. It needs to be seen. If you look at it directly, acknowledge it with your vision, it imprints on you." "What does that mean?" Sarah's voice was hoarse from crying. "You become part of its collection. It watches you wherever you go. Not constantly, but regularly. You'll see it in reflections, in windows, at the edges of your vision. Always watching, always there. Some people go mad from it. Others learn to live with it, though they're never quite the same." I asked why he rented out room 6 if he knew what would happen. He looked genuinely troubled by the question. "I don't want to, but it's territorial about that window. If I board it up or refuse to rent the room, it gets angry, breaks into other rooms, hurts people instead of just watching them. So I rent it, and I warn people, and I hope they're smart enough to heed the warnings." He paused. "Most aren't." We spent the rest of the night in that windowless room, Sarah dozing fitfully while I stayed awake, too afraid to close my eyes. At dawn, the old man unlocked the door and told us it was safe to leave. We gathered our things from room 6, the window completely shattered, glass covering everything, curtains torn to shreds. He refused to charge us for the stay. We drove straight to Boise without stopping, arriving exhausted and shaken. Sarah made me promise never to tell anyone what had happened, afraid people would think we were crazy. I agreed, though keeping that promise has been harder than I expected. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow that shouldn't be there, a figure standing just out of clear sight. I never look directly at it. I learned my lesson in Thornwood. But I know it's there, watching, waiting, hoping that eventually my curiosity will overcome my caution and I'll turn to face it. I never will. I'll live the rest of my life with this thing at the edge of my vision, this permanent companion I refuse to acknowledge. It's the price I pay for surviving that night, for being stubborn enough not to look when the voice demanded it. But sometimes I wonder about all the others, the ones who did look. Where are they now? Are they still alive, still sane? Or did the constant watching eventually break them? I'll never know, and that uncertainty is its own special kind of horror. If you ever find yourself driving through northern Idaho and see a sign for Thornwood, keep going. Don't stop there, no matter how tired you are or how appealing that lighted motel sign looks. And if you're foolish enough to ignore this warning and end up in room 6, for God's sake, keep those curtains closed. Don't look. No matter what you hear, no matter how desperate the voice becomes, don't look. Some things should never be seen. The watcher at the window is one of them.